Hi Angels. This is True Colors by the Angel Demon on AO3. Summary. Izuku Midoriya has spent years hiding his albinism from the world, dyeing his hair and wearing tinted contacts to blend in with his classmates. But after moving into the UA dorms, his carefully constructed disguise starts to crumble. When his secret is accidentally revealed, Izuku fears that his friends will see him as weak or fragile. Instead, he finds acceptance and support from his classmates and Aizawa, who adapt to his needs, without making him feel like a burden. As Izuku begins to embrace his true self, he realizes that his albinism doesn't define him, and that his strength lies in being himself, surrounded by people who believe in him. Izuku Midoriya had grown accustomed to hiding parts of himself. At first, it had been his quirkless status, trying to blend in with the other kids, pretending he wasn't different. Now, it was something else, something he had hidden even from his closest friends, something that made him feel more vulnerable than any lack of quirk ever had. His albinism. As a child, he hadn't understood why people would stare at him. Why the bright lights of the playground hurt his eyes, or why his pale skin always seemed to burn under the sun, no matter how much sunscreen his mom slathered on him. The constant need to squint and strain his eyes just to read something up close was a challenge he thought everyone faced. But as he grew older, it became clear that it wasn't normal. It was Inko who suggested the contacts when Izuku was 10, and by 12, they were a daily part of his routine. The dyed green hair came soon after, a subtle mimic of his mother's color, helping him blend into society more easily. It worked, people stopped staring. But the effort to keep it all hidden grew more exhausting as time passed. At UA, in the dorms, living with his classmates, the cracks were beginning to show. Izuku rolled over in his bed one morning, blinking groggily as the dim light of dawn filtered through his curtains. His eyes stung. A reminder that, as always, he had slept with his contacts in again. It wasn't good for his vision, he knew that, but he couldn't afford to slip, even for a moment. The thought of someone seeing his natural pale eyes filled him with dread. So, like every other morning, he forced himself to sit up, rubbing at his eyelids and heading to the bathroom to freshen up. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His contacts shimmered faintly in the low light, but behind them, he could still see the hint of his naturally pale blue-gray irises. His skin looked paler than usual, too. Was the hair dye fading already? He ran a hand through his hair, frowning. The green was holding up, but he'd need a touch-up soon if he wanted to keep it looking natural. Izuku sighed. Today was going to be another long day, and he hadn't gotten much sleep. The past few nights had been restless, the strain of constantly hiding himself weighing on him more than ever. But he couldn't afford to relax. Not now, not when he was living with his classmates in such close quarters. They couldn't find out. He wasn't ready for that kind of attention, for the questions and concerns that would come. Pulling on his uniform, Izuku steeled himself for the day ahead. The class had been buzzing with excitement for days. With the weather warming up, they were finally going to take a break from the intense training and head to the pool. It was a rare treat, time to unwind, swim, and enjoy the sun. But for Izuku, the thought filled him with a gnawing anxiety that he couldn't shake. He hated the sun. His albinism made his skin extra sensitive to ultraviolet rays, and no matter how much sunscreen he applied, he would still burn if he stayed out for too long. And his eyes, well, even with sunglasses, the bright light was blinding. It wasn't like he could wear contacts and sunglasses in the pool without drawing attention. As the class gathered around, excitedly discussing their plans for the day, Izuku kept his head down, half listening. It was only when Kaminari nudged him that he snapped back to reality. Midoriya, you're coming to the pool, right? Kaminari asked, flashing his usual grin. Yeah, of course, Izuku replied, forcing a smile. He couldn't very well say no, everyone would wonder why. And avoiding sunlight too often had already raised a few questions. Sweet. You've been training so hard, you deserve a break. Kirishima added, throwing an arm around Izuku's shoulder. Izuku chuckled nervously, glancing around the group. His classmates were all genuinely excited about the pool day, and they had no idea about the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. Still, he couldn't disappoint them. He'd just have to manage, like he always did. The pool area was beautiful, sparkling under the midday sun, and the class eagerly changed into their swimsuits. Izuku took his time, lagging behind the others in the changing room, dreading the moment he would step outside. When he finally emerged, the sun hit him like a wave, forcing him to squint. He was grateful for the sunglasses he had remembered to bring, but even they didn't block out the intensity of the light. As he walked toward the group, he could already feel the skin on his arms tingling. He had applied sunscreen, but the burning sensation was still there, creeping in. "You okay, Midoriya?" Uraraka asked, glancing at him as she stretched. "You look a little pale." Izuku laughed nervously. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night." In truth, he felt exposed. Every inch of his skin felt like it was under a microscope, and the bright sunlight made it harder to keep his usual facade intact. But he couldn't let anyone notice. Bakugo, lounging by the edge of the pool, noticed too, though he didn't say anything. His crimson eyes followed Izuku's movements with a sharp intensity, his brows furrowing slightly. He knew Midoriya better than anyone, had been watching him for years. And lately, something about the nerd's behavior had been off. "Oi, Deku!" Bakugo barked, causing Izuku to jump. "You gonna swim or just stand there?" Izuku blinked, startled, and nodded quickly. "Yeah. I'm coming." Without waiting for another moment to hesitate, Izuku hurried to the poolside and slipped into the water, grateful for the coolness that enveloped him. At least here, in the pool, the sun's rays weren't as harsh, and he could avoid the direct heat. But even in the water, he couldn't fully relax. Every time he removed his sunglasses to wipe the water from his eyes, he was hyper-aware of his classmates nearby, terrified that they might notice something was off. The tinted contacts helped, but they couldn't block out everything, and the bright sunlight overhead made his nystagmus worse. His eyes shook uncontrollably, and he had to focus hard just to keep his vision steady. As the class played and splashed around him, Izuku tried to blend in, but Bakugo's eyes were still on him, sharp and calculating. Later that day, after everyone had tired themselves out and was lounging by the pool, Izuku found a quiet spot under some shade. He needed a break, both from the sun and the constant vigilance of keeping his disguise intact. He leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. His skin tingled, and his head ached from the strain of the day. He could feel the burn starting on his arms, despite the sunscreen. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the emotional exhaustion that weighed him down. He just wanted to rest. To stop pretending for a while. "Midoriya," a voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked up, blinking to adjust his vision. Bakugo stood in front of him, arms crossed and expression unreadable. "You've been acting weird," Bakugo said bluntly. Izuku's heart raced. I am fine, Kaken." Bakugo narrowed his eyes. "Bullshit. You're hiding something." For a moment, Izuku froze, fear gripping his chest. Could Bakugo have figured it out? Could he see past the contacts, the dyed hair, the sunscreen? "I don't know what you're talking about," Izuku mumbled, trying to look away. Bakugo crouched down, getting eye level with him. "I'm not blind, Deku. You've been avoiding the sun like a damn vampire, squinting like you can't see shit. You think I'm not gonna notice?" I am just tired," Izuku stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. Bakugo scowled, but he didn't push further. He stood up, giving Izuku one last pointed look, before walking away. Izuku let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Bakugo was suspicious, more than anyone else. And if there was one thing Izuku knew about Bakugo, it was that he wouldn't stop until he had answers. By the time they returned to the dorms, Izuku was exhausted, his body aching from both the sun exposure and the constant stress of keeping up his disguise. He barely made it through dinner, before excusing himself, retreating to his room. He stood in front of his mirror once more, staring at his reflection. His hair was still green, but the roots were showing, pale, almost white. His contacts itched, his eyes sore from the strain of the day. With a sigh, he removed them, revealing his natural pale blue eyes. They trembled slightly in the dim light, the nystagmus never fully stopping. He couldn't keep this up forever. Hiding was exhausting. But the thought of anyone finding out, of his classmates seeing him as different, weak, was too much to bear. He splashed water on his face, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Outside, the dorms were alive with the usual chatter of his classmates, but Izuku felt isolated, trapped by his own fears. He had always hidden his albinism because he didn't want to be seen as fragile, as someone who needed special treatment. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. For now, though, Izuku would keep going. Keep pretending. But the cracks were growing larger, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Izuku tried to focus. He always did. Whether it was training, studying, or a fight, he gave it his all. But today, something was off. The sun was relentless, beating down on the training field without mercy, and Izuku could feel it in every inch of his skin. His contacts, which usually helped mask his condition, felt scratchy and dry. His eyes were trembling worse than usual, and the sunlight only amplified the discomfort. "All right, everyone, pair up," Aizawa called, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the class. Izuku blinked rapidly, trying to steady his vision. His nystagmus, the uncontrollable shaking of his eyes, was harder to manage under bright conditions like this. The sun reflecting off the ground made it even worse, and despite his best efforts, he was struggling to keep his balance as he stood with the rest of Class 1A. He took a deep breath and straightened his posture, reminding himself to focus. He couldn't afford to slip up. "Midoriya," Ida called out from beside him. "Let's go. We're paired up." Izuku nodded, flashing a quick smile to his friend. "Yeah, sure, Ida." They moved to the center of the training field, preparing for the sparring session. Izuku adjusted his stance, but as soon as Ida lunged forward with his usual precision and speed, Izuku felt his vision blur. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but the sun was directly in his eyes now, and the ground felt like it was tilting beneath his feet. Ida's kick came fast, too fast. Izuku stumbled, barely able to dodge in time. His foot caught on a loose patch of dirt, and he tripped, landing hard on his side with a grunt. The world spun for a moment, his vision swimming. "Midoriya." Ida's voice was full of concern as he rushed over to him. "I'm fine," Izuku muttered, quickly pushing himself up to his feet, though his head was still spinning. Just lost my balance." From the sidelines, Aizawa watched the interaction, his sharp eyes narrowing. He had been observing Midoriya for the past few weeks, noticing the subtle signs, small, but telling. Midoriya was good at hiding things, but Aizawa had a keen sense for when something was off with his students. Izuku took a deep breath, shaking off the dizziness. He could do this. He had to push through it. He couldn't let anyone know. The sparring match resumed, but it wasn't long before Izuku stumbled again. His vision blurred once more, and this time, he didn't even see Ida's attack coming. Aizawa's capture weapon was around him in an instant, pulling him away from the fight just before Ida's kick could land. "That's enough," Aizawa said, his voice calm but firm. Izuku winced, his heart racing. He hadn't even realized how much he had been straining himself. The sun, the heat, the constant effort to focus, it was all taking its toll. "Midoriya, with me," Aizawa ordered. The rest of the class exchanged glances, but didn't comment. They knew better than to question Aizawa when he pulled someone aside. But Izuku's heart pounded in his chest as he followed his teacher across the field. This was bad. Really bad. Inside the shade of the training facility, Aizawa finally stopped, turning to face Izuku. His expression was unreadable, but Izuku could feel the weight of his gaze. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," Aizawa said, his voice as neutral as ever. "I'm fine," Izuku replied quickly, too quickly. "I can handle it." Aizawa raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Izuku hesitated. He had been hiding it for so long, years, really. Ever since he started at UA, he had worked tirelessly to keep his albinism a secret. He didn't want to be seen as different or fragile. He didn't want people to pity him or treat him like he needed special accommodations. But now, under Aizawa's scrutinizing gaze, it felt like all the cracks were beginning to show. I'm sorry," Izuku muttered, looking down at the ground. "I know I've been off lately." Aizawa crossed his arms, watching him closely. "That's not what I'm concerned about. Your performance has been slipping for weeks, Midoriya. You're not acting like yourself." Izuku clenched his fists at his sides, struggling with the urge to blurt out the truth. But admitting it felt like exposing a weakness, one that he wasn't ready to share. "I'm fine," he repeated, his voice wavering slightly. Aizawa's eyes softened, just for a moment. "No, you're not." The words cut through Izuku's defenses, and he felt his shoulders slump in defeat. His secret was tearing him apart. He couldn't keep pretending. Izuku took a shaky breath, finally meeting Aizawa's eyes. "I have albinism." There it was. The truth. Out in the open. Aizawa didn't react right away. He didn't look surprised, or confused, or even pitying. He just listened. "I've had it my whole life," Izuku continued, the words spilling out now that he had started. "It affects my vision, and my skin is really sensitive to the sun. That's why I wear contacts and dye my hair. I didn't want anyone to know because I didn't want them to treat me differently." Aizawa nodded slowly, processing the information. "You should have told me." Izuku flinched. "I know, I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to seem weak." Aizawa's eyes softened again, but his tone remained steady. "This doesn't make you weak, Midoriya. Everyone has limits. The important thing is knowing how to work within them." Izuku blinked, stunned by how calmly Aizawa was handling this. He didn't know what he had expected. Maybe pity, maybe frustration, maybe disappointment. But Aizawa's response was none of those things. "We'll make adjustments," Aizawa continued, his voice matter of fact. "Training sessions earlier in the morning or later in the evening, when the sun isn't as intense. I'll talk to Power Loader about getting you some specialized gear, tinted goggles, maybe, or something else that can help you in bright environments." Izuku stared at him, his mouth slightly open. You're not upset?" Aizawa raised an eyebrow. "Why would I be upset?" Izuku fumbled for an answer. "Because I didn't tell you sooner? Because I've been hiding it?" Aizawa shook his head. "Midoriya, you've been dealing with this on your own for a long time. I get that. But you're not on your own anymore. You're part of a team now, and that means we adapt. This changes nothing about your potential." Izuku felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words until now. His whole life, he had been afraid that people would see him as less capable, less worthy, if they knew the truth. But Aizawa didn't see him as weak. He saw him as someone who had adapted to his circumstances and was still pushing forward. "Thank you," Izuku whispered, his voice barely audible. Aizawa gave a small nod. Get some rest. We'll start adjusting things tomorrow. Izuku turned to leave, but before he could walk away, Aizawa spoke again. And Midoriya? Izuku paused, glancing back. Don't hide things like this again, Aizawa said, his tone firm but not harsh. If something's affecting your performance, you come to me. Understood? Izuku nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Yes, sir. The next morning, things were different. Aizawa had made good on his word, rescheduling the training sessions for the early morning when the sun was barely above the horizon, casting soft, golden light over the training field instead of the harsh midday sun that had caused Izuku so much trouble. For the first time in weeks, Izuku didn't feel like he was constantly battling his own body, just to keep up. His vision was clearer, his skin wasn't burning, and he could focus on what really mattered, improving his skills, becoming stronger. Aizawa had also spoken to Power Loader, who was already working on a pair of specialized tinted goggles for Izuku. They would protect his eyes during training in bright conditions, without drawing too much attention. It was a small adjustment, but it made all the difference. Izuku had always admired Aizawa for his no-nonsense approach to teaching, but now, his respect for his teacher grew even deeper. Aizawa hadn't just adapted the training to accommodate him, he had done it quietly, without making a big deal out of it, without singling him out. It felt normal. And that's all Izuku had ever wanted. As the days passed, Izuku noticed that his classmates were too focused on their own training to pay much attention to the subtle changes in the schedule or the new gear he was using. He felt more comfortable, more at ease, knowing that he didn't have to hide anymore, at least, not from Aizawa. But even though he had shared his secret with his teacher, he wasn't ready to tell the others. Not yet. The thought of explaining it to his friends, of seeing their reactions, still filled him with anxiety. He wasn't sure how long he could keep it from them, though. Especially with the dorms and the constant proximity to his classmates. The cracks in his mask were already showing. And sooner or later, they were bound to notice. The common room was peaceful, a soft glow from the lamps casting warm light over the room. Most of Class 1A had retired for the night, leaving only a few lingering students behind, quietly studying or chatting in low voices. Izuku Midoriya sat on the couch near the window, his textbook spread across the table in front of him. The evening was cool, the gentle hum of the dorm's ventilation system lulling him into a sense of calm. It had been a long day, filled with training and study sessions, and the weight of it was finally starting to catch up to him. For once, the dim light of the common room was a comfort. There were no harsh overhead lights to strain his eyes, no glaring sun to force him into constant vigilance. Here, in the relative darkness, he could relax. He rubbed at his tired eyes, feeling the familiar itch of his contacts, and hesitated. Usually, he never let his guard down, not even for a moment. But right now, everyone seemed to be occupied or already in their rooms. The temptation to slip his contacts out and rest his eyes for a bit was too strong to resist. With a quiet sigh, Izuku leaned back against the couch, carefully removing his contacts and placing them in the small case he always carried with him. The relief was immediate. His pale blue-gray eyes, usually hidden behind tinted lenses, blinked open in the soft light, the familiar tremble of his nystagmus calming as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. For the first time all day, Izuku allowed himself to truly relax. Across the room, Uraraka, Todoroki, and Shinso were sitting at a small table, quietly reviewing notes for their upcoming assignments. Uraraka yawned, stretching her arms above her head and glancing around the common room. Her gaze landed on Izuku, who appeared to be dozing off on the couch, his head tilted slightly to the side. He's been working so hard lately, Uraraka murmured, her voice soft with concern. I don't think he's been getting enough rest. Todoroki glanced over at Izuku as well, his expression unreadable. Midoriya does tend to push himself. He's probably fine, Shinso added, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. But, maybe we should check on him, just in case. The three of them exchanged glances, and after a moment, Uraraka stood up. I'll go wake him. He'll hurt his neck if he sleeps like that. The others followed her across the room, toward the couch where Izuku was resting. His face was peaceful, his breathing even, and for a moment, Uraraka hesitated, not wanting to disturb him. But then, as she leaned in closer, something caught her attention. Wait, Uraraka whispered, her brow furrowing in confusion. His eyes, there. Pale, Todoroki finished, his voice soft with surprise. He knelt beside the couch, staring at Izuku's pale blue-gray eyes, now visible in the dim light. The nystagmus, the constant, subtle movement of his eyes, was more noticeable now, and both Uraraka and Shinso noticed it immediately. That's not what his eyes usually look like, right? Shinso asked, his tone quiet but full of curiosity. No, Uraraka whispered, her mind racing. He usually has green eyes, right? The three of them exchanged puzzled looks. This wasn't the Midoriya they were used to seeing. His eyes, his slightly faded hair, something was different. Something he had been hiding. Midoriya, Todoroki called softly, shaking his shoulder gently. Izuku stirred, blinking groggily as he slowly woke from his brief nap. For a moment, he didn't realize what was wrong. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, still half asleep, but as his vision cleared and he saw Todoroki, Uraraka, and Shinso all staring at him, a sudden jolt of panic shot through his chest. His contacts. His hair. They could see everything. Izuku froze, his heart pounding in his chest. I can explain. Uraraka, sensing his distress, quickly held up her hands. Hey, it's okay. We're just a little surprised. That's all. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. He could see the concern in their eyes, the confusion. And worse, he could feel their attention on him, on the very things he had tried so hard to hide. His pale eyes, his trembling vision, the roots of his hair where the green dye had started to fade, revealing the stark whiteness beneath. I'm sorry, Izuku blurted, scrambling to gather his belongings. I didn't mean, I just. Midoriya, wait, Todoroki said, his voice calm, but firm. You don't have to apologize. We're not upset. Izuku's hands trembled as he stuffed his books into his bag, his mind racing with panic. He had been so careful, so determined to keep his albinism a secret. But now they knew. And they were staring at him. They must think he was weak, strange, different. I should go, Izuku mumbled, standing up from the couch. I'm sorry. Before anyone could stop him, Izuku bolted from the room, rushing down the hall, toward his own dorm. His vision blurred with tears, and he could feel his heart racing, his chest tightening with fear. He had worked so hard to keep this part of himself hidden, to avoid the questions, the stares. And now, his secret was out. Todoroki, Uraraka, and Shinso watched him leave, the room falling into an uneasy silence. What just happened? Shinso asked quietly, his brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know, Uraraka replied, her voice filled with concern. But, something's been bothering him. I've noticed it for a while. Todoroki nodded, his eyes still focused on the door where Izuku had disappeared. He's been acting differently lately. More tired, more strained. He looked scared, Shinso added, his tone thoughtful. Like he didn't want us to see him like that. Uraraka sat back down on the couch, her heart heavy with worry. Do you think, maybe he's been hiding something? Maybe something about his health? Todoroki didn't respond right away. Instead, he replayed the moments leading up to Izuku's sudden departure. The pale eyes, the nystagmus, the way his hair had looked, almost white at the roots. It all pointed to something they hadn't known about him. Something he had gone to great lengths to conceal. "He's not the type to talk about his problems," Todoroki said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "But I think we need to give him space right now. If we push too hard, he'll just retreat further." Uraraka nodded slowly. "I don't want him to feel like we're judging him. He must have had a reason to hide it." Shinso crossed his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "If he's been hiding something like this for so long, it must be important to him. Maybe he's afraid we'll see him differently." "But we won't," Uraraka said, her voice firm. "We care about him, no matter what." Todoroki glanced at her, his expression softening. "I know that. And I think he knows it too. But, he needs time to process this. We'll approach him when he's ready." The three of them sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. They had all noticed Izuku's subtle changes over the past few weeks, his fatigue, his strained focus during training, the way he seemed to avoid certain environments. And now, it all made sense. There was more to Izuku than any of them had realized, and it was clear that he had been carrying the weight of this secret for a long time. "He doesn't have to do this alone," Uraraka said quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. "We'll let him know that when he's ready." Izuku slammed the door to his dorm room, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he leaned against the wall. His heart was still racing, his mind spinning with panic and dread. They had seen Uraraka, Todoroki, Shinso. They had seen him without his contacts, without the green hair dye that he had used to hide his true appearance. What were they thinking now? Did they think he was weak? Strange? Izuku sank to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He had always been afraid of this, afraid that if people saw his albinism, they would treat him differently. He didn't want to be pitted, didn't want to be seen as fragile or in need of special treatment. That's why he had gone to such great lengths to hide it, to make sure no one knew. But now it was too late. They knew. Tears pricked at his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to feel like this. But the fear, the anxiety, it was overwhelming. He couldn't shake the image of their faces, the confusion, the concern. They must think he had been lying to them this whole time. Hiding something so important. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, trembling, his thoughts spiraling out of control. But eventually, exhaustion began to take over. His body was still tired from the long day of training, and now, with the emotional weight of the evening pressing down on him, his eyelids grew heavy. Slowly, Izuku climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. Maybe he could figure out what to do tomorrow. Maybe he could find a way to explain. But for now, all he wanted was to escape the crushing weight of his fear, even if only for a few hours of sleep. Back in the common room, Todoroki, Uraraka, and Shinso sat quietly, the weight of the evening hanging heavily in the air. "We'll talk to him tomorrow," Todoroki said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But we'll let him come to us when he's ready." Uraraka nodded, her heart aching for her friend. She just wanted him to know that they cared about him, no matter what. "He's always been there for us," she said softly. "It's our turn to be there for him." Shinso leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "We'll give him the time he needs. But we won't let him carry this alone." The three of them exchanged a quiet look of understanding. They had no idea what Izuku had been through, or why he had hidden this part of himself for so long. But one thing was certain, they would support him, no matter what. Because that's what friends did. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Izuku's dorm room, soft and pale, casting shadows across the walls. Izuku lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind still racing from the events of the previous night. He had barely slept, his thoughts too jumbled, his emotions too raw. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the confusion and concern on his friends' faces. Uraraka, Todoroki, Shinso, they had seen him, really seen him, and the fear of what they must think now gnawed at him like a persistent ache. He knew he couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face them. But that didn't make it any easier. Izuku sighed, sitting up in bed and running a hand through his hair. His natural pale roots were starting to show more prominently beneath the fading green dye, a reminder of the part of himself he had kept hidden for so long. The thought of walking out into the common area, of seeing his friends again after last night, made his heart race with anxiety. What if they thought less of him now? What if they saw him as fragile, someone who needed to be protected? The last thing he wanted was to be treated differently because of his albinism. He had worked so hard to keep it a secret, to prove that he could stand on equal footing with his classmates, but now everything had changed. With a heavy sigh, Izuku stood up and got dressed. He hesitated for a moment before slipping his tinted contacts back in, the familiar weight of them grounding him in some small way. Even if his secret was out, he wasn't ready to give up the facade completely. Not yet. He left his room, his steps slow and uncertain as he made his way down the hall. The common room was already buzzing with activity, his classmates chatting, laughing, and preparing for the day ahead. Izuku's stomach twisted with nerves as he spotted Uraraka, Todoroki, and Shinso sitting at their usual table, quietly talking among themselves. For a moment, Izuku considered turning around, retreating back to the safety of his room. But then Todoroki glanced up, his sharp eyes locking onto Izuku's, and there was no going back. Midoriya, Todoroki called softly, his voice calm but firm. Come over here for a minute. Izuku froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady the rising tide of anxiety. Slowly, he made his way over to the table, feeling the weight of his friends' gazes on him with every step. Uraraka smiled gently as he approached, her expression full of warmth and understanding. Good morning, Izuku. How are you feeling? Izuku swallowed hard, his throat tight. I'm fine, he lied, his voice barely above a whisper. Todoroki's gaze softened as he motioned for Izuku to sit down. We wanted to talk to you about last night. Izuku hesitated but eventually sat down across from them, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He didn't know what to expect, an interrogation, maybe, or a barrage of questions about why he had been hiding his albinism. But when he looked up, he didn't see judgment in their eyes. Only concern. And that, somehow, made it harder to bear. I'm sorry, Izuku blurted, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't mean to keep it from you. I didn't want you to see me differently. Uraraka reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his. Izuku, it's okay. We're not upset. We're just worried about you. Todoroki nodded, his tone calm and steady. You don't have to apologize for who you are. None of us think any less of you. Izuku's breath caught in his throat, his eyes stinging with the threat of tears. He had been so terrified that they would see him as weak, as someone who needed to be coddled or pitied. But the kindness in their voices, the warmth in their eyes, it wasn't what he had expected. And it made the wall he had built around himself start to crumble. I've been hiding it for so long, Izuku admitted, his voice shaky. My albinism. I've had it my whole life, and it affects everything, my vision, my skin, how I handle sunlight. That's why I wear contacts and dye my hair. I didn't want anyone to know, because I didn't want to be treated differently. Shinso, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. You've been dealing with all of that on your own? For how long? Izuku looked down at his hands, his shoulders tense. Since I was a kid. I've always tried to hide it because I didn't want to be seen as fragile or less capable. Uraraka's eyes softened with understanding. But you're not less capable, Izuku. You're one of the strongest people I know. Todoroki leaned forward slightly, his expression serious, but kind. We don't see you any differently, because of this. You're still the same Midoriya. Nothing has changed. Izuku's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. He had been so afraid of this moment, so afraid of how they would react. But hearing their words, feeling their acceptance, was like a weight lifting off his shoulders. I was scared, Izuku whispered, his voice barely audible. Scared that if you knew, you'd think I was weak. That you'd treat me like I needed to be protected. Todoroki shook his head. We don't think you're weak. You've been dealing with something incredibly difficult on your own, and you're still standing. That's strength, Midoriya. Uraraka nodded in agreement. We're your friends, Izuku. We're here to support you, not treat you any differently. Shinso leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. And if there's anything we can do to make things easier for you, just let us know. We're a team, after all. Izuku blinked, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief. He had been so consumed by the fear of being seen as different that he hadn't even considered the possibility that his friends might accept him without judgment. But here they were, offering their support without hesitation, without making him feel like a burden. Thank you, Izuku said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Uraraka replied with a gentle smile. Just know that we're here for you, no matter what. Izuku nodded, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He had spent so long hiding this part of himself, carrying the weight of his secret alone. But now, with his friends by his side, that weight didn't feel so heavy anymore. The rest of the day passed more easily than Izuku had expected. Though his anxiety still lingered, the overwhelming fear of rejection had subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. His friends hadn't shunned him. They hadn't treated him any differently, except to be more mindful of his comfort. It was a small change, but it made all the difference. In the afternoon, when the sun was at its peak, Todoroki and Ida suggested moving their study session inside instead of the usual courtyard gathering. They didn't make a big deal of it, but Izuku noticed the subtle way they adapted their plans to accommodate him without drawing attention to his sensitivity to light. And when they trained later that evening, Aizawa had already made sure the session took place after sunset, the soft glow of the stadium lights replacing the harsh sunlight that Izuku had struggled with so often before. During the session, Izuku caught Aizawa's eye across the training field, and the quiet acknowledgement in his teacher's gaze told him that the changes had been intentional. Aizawa didn't say anything about it, didn't call attention to the fact that the schedule had been adjusted for Izuku's benefit, but the silent support was there, and it filled Izuku with a sense of gratitude. Aizawa's understanding, like his friend's acceptance, made everything feel a little lighter. Later that evening, after the day's training had come to an end, Izuku found himself back in the common room, surrounded by his closest friends. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with the usual chatter and laughter that came with the end of a long day. Izuku sat on the couch, his textbook spread out in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at his friends, watching the way they interacted, the way they treated him. And slowly, the realization began to sink in. They hadn't changed. Not in the way he had feared. They hadn't started treating him like he was fragile or different. They were still the same friends he had always known, supportive, kind, and accepting. Midoriya, Ida's voice broke through his thoughts, drawing his attention. Are you all right? You seem a bit distracted. Izuku blinked, startled by the question. He hadn't realized he had been staring off into space. Oh, I'm fine, he replied quickly, offering a small smile. Just thinking. Ida raised an eyebrow, his expression curious, but concerned. About what? Izuku hesitated for a moment, glancing around at his friends. Todoroki, Uraraka, Shinso, and Ida, all of them were looking at him with the same warmth and understanding that they had shown earlier. They weren't pressuring him, weren't expecting anything from him, but their presence alone was enough to remind Izuku that he didn't have to carry this burden by himself anymore. Just, how grateful I am, Izuku admitted quietly, his voice soft but sincere. For all of you. Uraraka's smile widened as she leaned forward. We're grateful for you too, Izuku. Shinso nodded, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. We're a team. We've got your back. Todoroki's expression softened as he looked at Izuku. You're not alone in this, Midoriya. You never were. Izuku felt a warmth spread through his chest, a deep sense of relief and acceptance settling in. He had spent so long hiding, so long fearing that he would be seen as different, but now he knew that he didn't have to hide anymore. His friends saw him for who he was, his strengths, his struggles, all of it, and they accepted him, just as he was. For the first time in what felt like forever, Izuku allowed himself to breathe. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as Izuku stood in front of the mirror in his dorm room, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in a long while, his reflection didn't make him flinch or tense with anxiety. The green hair dye was completely gone, washed away, revealing his natural pale white strands. His eyes, still trembling slightly from the constant nystagmus, stared back at him, tinted a soft blue-gray that reflected the cool morning light. It was still strange to see himself like this, unhidden, unmasked. There was no green hair to match his mother's, no tinted contacts to make his eyes seem more normal. It was just him. Raw and real. Izuku smiled slightly, though the feeling was bittersweet. He had spent years perfecting his disguise, trying to blend in and hide his albinism from the world. But now, that disguise was gone, and for the first time, he wasn't terrified. He wasn't entirely comfortable either. There was still a part of him that wanted to shrink away, to hide again, but the weight of his secret had lifted, and with it came a new kind of freedom. His classmates knew. His friends knew. And they didn't see him any differently. With a sigh, Izuku grabbed his tinted goggles from his desk and slipped them over his eyes. They had been a gift from Power Loader, custom-made to help him handle bright environments without straining his vision too much. He still wore his contacts sometimes, mostly for convenience, but the goggles had quickly become his favorite. They were lightweight and subtle, with just enough tint to take the edge off harsh lights without making him feel like he was drawing too much attention. He glanced at his watch and realized he was running a bit late for training. Aizawa had shifted the schedule again, moving their sessions to the early mornings or late evenings to avoid the harsh midday sun. It was a small change, but one that had made a world of difference for Izuku. Grabbing his hero costume, Izuku headed for the door, a sense of calm settling over him. Today was going to be another tough day of training, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to hide. The training field was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. Most of Class 1A had already arrived, stretching and warming up for the session ahead. As Izuku approached, he noticed Bakugo off to the side, his usual scowl firmly in place as he stretched his arms over his head. Bakugo glanced up as Izuku walked over, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of Izuku's pale hair and tinted goggles. "TCH," Bakugo grunted, but there was no malice in his voice. "You finally decided to stop hiding, huh?" Izuku smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess I did." Bakugo's eyes flicked to the goggles, then back to Izuku's face. For a moment, he didn't say anything, but then he smirked, a challenging glint in his eyes. "About time. Now maybe you'll stop holding back in training." Izuku blinked, caught off guard. "Holding back?" Bakugo snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Don't act like you don't know. You've been dragging your ass for weeks, trying to keep up this stupid act. Now that you're not wasting energy hiding your quirkless skin, maybe you'll finally start pushing yourself." Izuku's eyes widened in surprise, but Bakugo's tone wasn't mocking or harsh. It was encouraging. In his own roundabout way, Bakugo was telling him that he expected more from Izuku, not less. That his albinism didn't change anything, not in Bakugo's eyes. A wave of gratitude washed over Izuku, and he nodded, determination settling in his chest. You're right. I'll do better. Bakugo's smirk widened, and he cracked his knuckles. You better. I don't want any excuses when I kick your ass in training today. Izuku laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Bakugo's rough-edged encouragement was exactly what he needed, no special treatment, no pity. Just the same rivalry that had always pushed him to be better. Deal, Izuku said with a grin. Training that day was as intense as ever. Aizawa didn't hold back, putting the class through a series of grueling exercises designed to push them to their limits. But Izuku found himself more focused, more in control than he had been in a long time. With the goggles shielding his eyes from the harsh light, he could concentrate on his movements, on his quirk, without the constant strain of his vision getting in the way. As he sparred with Shinso, exchanging blows and dodging attacks, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wasn't worried about hiding his condition, wasn't constantly thinking about how to keep up his disguise. He was just Izuku. Fighting, learning, growing. Shinso noticed too, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth as they squared off for another round. You're faster today, he remarked, blocking one of Izuku's punches. Izuku ducked under Shinso's counterattack, his movements fluid and precise. I guess I have more energy now that I'm not worrying about my contacts falling out, he replied with a laugh. Shinso chuckled, stepping back to reset their stance. Whatever it is, keep it up. You're getting harder to predict. Izuku grinned, feeling a surge of pride at the compliment. Shinso was one of the few people in the class who had been keeping a close eye on him since the revelation about his albinism. And instead of treating him with kid gloves, Shinso had pushed him harder, forcing Izuku to rise to the challenge. It was exactly what Izuku needed. The training session continued, and by the time Aizawa finally called for a break, Izuku was drenched in sweat, his muscles burning from the exertion. But he felt good. Better than he had in a long time. As he sat down to catch his breath, Uraraka jogged over, offering him a bottle of water. You were amazing out there today, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. I could tell you were holding back before, but now, you're even faster than before. Izuku smiled, accepting the water gratefully. Thanks, Uraraka. I feel a lot better now that I don't have to worry about hiding anything. Uraraka plopped down beside him, her expression softening. I'm really glad you're not hiding anymore, Izuku. We've always seen you as strong, but now, you seem lighter, like you're finally comfortable being yourself. Izuku's heart swelled with warmth at her words. It had been a long journey to get to this point, and there were still moments when he felt the familiar pull of anxiety, the urge to hide. But sitting here, surrounded by his friends, he realized that he didn't have to carry that fear anymore. They accepted him for who he was, his strengths, his struggles, all of it. Yeah, Izuku said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise higher in the sky. I think I'm finally starting to accept it too. As the days passed, the subtle changes in Izuku's life became more pronounced. His classmates, ever supportive, continued to make small accommodations without making a big deal of it. They dimmed the lights in common areas when necessary, avoided scheduling outdoor activities during the brightest parts of the day, and kept an eye out for environments that might be uncomfortable for him. But despite these adjustments, nothing felt forced or awkward. His friends didn't treat him like he was fragile, didn't coddle him or make him feel like a burden. They simply adapted, as any good team would. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, during a rare break in their busy schedule, Izuku found himself sitting in the common room with Todoroki and Ida, reviewing notes for their upcoming exams. The sunlight streamed through the windows, but the curtains had been drawn just enough to soften the brightness, creating a comfortable, ambient glow. Todoroki glanced up from his notes, his gaze flicking to Izuku's goggles. "Are the goggles working well for you?" Izuku nodded, adjusting the strap slightly. "Yeah, they're great. Power Loader really outdid himself. I can see clearly without straining too much." Todoroki nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I've noticed your focus has improved during training." Ida, who had been meticulously organizing his notes, chimed in. "It's good to see you performing at your best, Midoriya. Your energy seems more balanced now." Izuku smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude. His friends had noticed the difference in him, not just in his physical performance, but in his overall demeanor. He felt lighter, more at ease, and it showed. As they continued studying, Bakugo walked past, pausing just long enough to throw a glance in Izuku's direction. "You better not slack off just 'cause everyone's giving you special treatment," Bakugo muttered, though there was no real bite to his words. Izuku grinned. "Wouldn't dream of it, Kac. Chan." Bakugo huffed, but Izuku could see the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he walked away. Later that evening, after dinner, the class gathered in the common room for some much-needed downtime. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and chatter as they unwound from the day's training. Izuku sat on one of the couches, watching his friends interact, a contented smile on his face. There was a time when he would have felt anxious in a setting like this, worried that someone might notice his pale hair or his trembling eyes, afraid that they would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But now, that anxiety had faded. His friends knew, and they accepted him. There was no need to hide anymore. As he sat there, Aizawa entered the room, his usual tired expression in place as he scanned the group. His gaze landed on Izuku, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Aizawa gave a small nod, the gesture subtle but meaningful. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened, the changes, the growth, the acceptance. Izuku nodded back, a surge of gratitude welling up inside him. Aizawa had been there for him, quietly supporting him from the beginning. He had made adjustments without making Izuku feel like a burden, had pushed him to keep growing without letting his condition hold him back. It was that quiet, unwavering support that had made all the difference. As the evening wore on, the common room began to empty as students headed off to bed. Izuku stayed behind, sitting by the window and watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. He thought back to the beginning of his time at UA, how hard he had worked to keep his albinism a secret, how much energy he had spent trying to blend in and avoid drawing attention. He had been so afraid of being seen as weak or different, so terrified that his condition would overshadow his abilities. But now, sitting here in the quiet stillness of the dorms, Izuku realized that he didn't need to hide anymore. His friends had seen him at his most vulnerable, and instead of pushing him away, they had drawn closer. They hadn't treated him like he was fragile or incapable. They had simply accepted him for who he was, quirks and all. For the first time in a long while, Izuku felt comfortable in his own skin. He wasn't just the boy with albinism. He wasn't just the kid who had struggled to fit in. He was Izuku Midoriya, strong, determined, and capable. His albinism was a part of him, but it didn't define him. And now, he knew that it didn't have to hold him back. With a soft sigh, Izuku leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the stars. His journey wasn't over, there was still so much more to learn, so much more to grow. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't alone. His friends, his classmates, and Aizawa had his back. Not despite his condition, but alongside it. They had seen the part of him that he had been so afraid to reveal, and instead of turning away, they had embraced it. Izuku smiled to himself, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be. This is the end of True Colors, by the Angel Demon on AO3. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any suggestion, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to know when the next one is out. Have a good day, angels.